Hi everybody. Today's video I'm going to talk a little bit about the foundations of morality. The ethics lecture is going to be dealing with really problems in grounding morality, and what I want to do is try to look at 5 potential problems that face us in order to build an ethical system. And I'm going to start by talking about what does it mean to talk about a foundation for ethics. A lot of philosophers historically have tried to find a foundation of certainty upon which to build any kind of system. And you want to think of a foundation. Sometimes we use the word grounding for a system. A foundation, like the analogy with a building. You don't build something unless there's a stable foundation to set it upon, because if the foundation is not certain or sure or secure, then what you build is going to collapse. And ethical systems are basically the same types of things, analogously, the same types of things. What you want to do is find, if you can, some kind of thing to build an ethical system upon, where you're going to have ethical value judgments and different beliefs that are going to rest on something that is going to be stable, okay, for the most part. And a lot of times people are going to look, at least foundationalists, not everybody believes ethics can be situated upon some kind of foundation, but the foundationalist does believe that there should be something like that behind an ethical system. And one of the things that we look for would be some kind of first principle, some kind of self-evident first principle. And when I use the term self-evident, what I'm talking about is not something that you automatically know, right, or just aware of necessarily, but the idea of self-evidence can be something like, if you understand the concept, then you are not able to deny it, okay? And in logic, for instance, which is foundation of all good philosophy, at least, there is the core principles, which we call the laws of logic, which are our first principles of reasoning. And the core principle among the principles of reasoning is what's called the law of non-contradiction. So using that as a standard, we could talk about maybe certain other things that we could find self-evident as not violating the law of non-contradiction. So we could actually talk about claims that we might make, and we can know that the claim is certain or true if any attempt to negate that claim results in a contradiction, because contradictions are necessarily false. So if the negation of a claim ends up being false, then the claim itself must be true. And I can give an example of saying that a circle is round. Okay, I mean, it's not a very profound statement, but a circle is round may be a claim. If I was going to deny that statement or negate that statement by saying something like a circle is not round, what I end up with is a contradiction, because circle includes the idea of roundness. So it's like saying a circle is not a circle, which is patently false. So therefore, the opposite of that claim, which is the original proposition, a circle is round, must be true, and I could be certain of that. Okay, I'm just using that as an example. Philosophically, the most famous individual in modern philosophy who attempted to give a foundation for a philosophical system was René Descartes. You've probably heard of the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," the cogito ergo sum. He had a methodical process by which he attempted to find something he could not deny and start from that basic undeniable truth to then build some kind of system of reasoning about the rest of reality. Seems like quite an ambitious approach, but he started with this idea that he's going to question everything he could possibly question until he could find that one thing that he was not able to doubt. And he starts, of course, by doubting. Well, he actually gets to the point where he is going to doubt whether he is even doubting. And realize, of course, if you doubt that you're doubting, it only proves that you're doubting, because doubt is a form. The more you doubt that you're doubting, of course, that just emphasizes the doubting aspect. And of course, doubt is a form of thought. So he realizes, if I'm doubting, I must be thinking. And for me to be thinking, I must exist, because you have to have something doing the thinking that is actually in existence. And this is kind of his reasoning process. I may not have done that very clearly for you guys. I'm kind of going quickly through this stuff before I get to the actual meat of the presentation. But that's basically his starting point. Okay. Now, as far as ethics goes, there have been different attempts to try to find some kind of foundation. And there's the question whether or not you can ever find a certain foundation to build an ethical system upon. I'm just going to introduce this one concept of intuitionalism. G.E. Moore basically starts with this idea that you are going to have certain moral principles that are just self-evident, that they don't need an analysis, they don't need any kind of justification or even an explanation. And if we have those things, then we can use those as a foundation for an ethical system. Now, whether that's a good start is, I think, questionable personally. But what he talks about, this intuition, this sense of, what is good, because good itself is a very difficult term to define, as you'll see as we go through the rest of the semester. And we'll look at some of the problems with trying to define it today when we get into what's called the fact-value distinction, or particularly the naturalistic fallacy. So we'll come to that in a little bit. But more basically claims that the good is what we might call a non-natural property that can be pointed to, but it can't really be analyzed or defined, right? So if you think about defining something, what you're doing in defining it is breaking it down into its component parts. So if I was, again, going to use an example of a triangle, try to define what a triangle is, I would talk about it having three sides. I would talk about it being a geometric figure. I might talk about it having, an internal, the angles internally will add up to 180 degrees and whatnot. Okay. That's how I can, again, conceptualize what it means to be a triangle. I can do the same thing when I'm talking about human beings, right? What is a human being, or a person, or a man, or however you want to say it? You talk about it being, well, human being is an animal. Human being is also a mammal, right? A certain section of the animal community. And you may start to add individual distinguishing features that may be common to humans and not common to other mammals, right? So maybe rationality and various things, the ability to do math, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we break it down. When we talk about something being simple, we mean it can't be broken down any further. And a good example, as you'll see in the PowerPoint, would be something like a color. So if we talked about the color yellow, if I was going to define that to somebody, I really wouldn't be able to. You can imagine trying to explain yellow to a blind person. I'm not going to be able to break it down. The only thing I can do is point to something and say, that's it. All right. So that's the idea of some kind of simple characteristic. And he's saying the good is like that. I can't define what it is exactly. I can point to it, but that's about as far as I can go. Now the question, because again, we're talking about problems in trying to ground morality. Intuitionalism aside, whether that's a good start, like I said, is questionable. I want to get to other problems. And the question that we're going to look at right now is there some fact about the natural world, human nature, or human desires that can serve as a solid foundation for a moral system and can direct one as to what we should strive to be, or strive to achieve, strive to do, and kind of set our goals. So is there something like that out there? Is there some fact about the way the world is that we could begin with? Okay. Now this, I think, can be problematic. So the first problem that I want to discuss among the five, and I'm going to do, I think, 2 of them in this presentation, and then I'm going to do the others in a separate presentation. I've got them broken down by PowerPoint for you guys. But the first problem is called the fact-value distinction. This is, I would say, a pretty difficult problem to deal with. Depending again on your philosophical background, but most modern ethicists realize that there is a distinction between what we call facts and values. As you see on the screen, there is also this distinction between what we say is and ought. So when we talk about fact, value, is, ought, problem, we're basically saying facts. We're going to group those with the term is, okay? Things that just are, okay, about the reality. When we talk about values, we're talking about how things ought to be. And the idea here is those two things don't really go together, and that you can't derive an ought from an is. You can't derive a value from a fact. And this goes back to some of the writings that we find in David Hume. Very influential philosopher, one of the most sharp minds in the modern philosophical era. And he brought up a lot of things that we're still dealing with as ethicists. And he basically removes a foundation from ethics by implying this idea that no is implies an ought. And of course, the result of that distinction is that there's no moral claims that can be logically derived from mere factual claims. So let's look at this a little bit more carefully. So let me give you an example. The statement I'm going to make: it's morally wrong to torture children just for pleasure. Now, I'm making a value judgment in saying that, right? I'm saying you ought not to torture children for pleasure. Now, the problem with this distinction is that there's no factual claim, at least no value-free description of the world from which the principle can be logically derived. And when I say value-free, I mean without a term that's kind of implicitly bringing values into the picture. So, for instance, X murdered Y seems to be a value-loaded statement because the word murder has a kind of negative connotations. It's the idea of wrongful killing, where if I say X killed Y, that's a little bit more neutral. It's just an example of what I mean by maybe value-loaded. Certain words have more of a judgment that's kind of implied in there. All right, so let's look at these facts about the world, going back to that idea that it's wrong to torture innocent children simply for pleasure. So here's some facts that we could say about torture. Number one, torture causes children great pain. Okay, that could be empirically tested. It's obvious. Most people would be horrified to see children tortured. That, again, can be verified, people's reactions. Prolonged torture can cause permanent damage to children. No child wants to be tortured. All of these are facts about the world that can be tested, verified, etc. Okay, there simply is claims. These are the way things simply are. Now, none of these facts, however, entails the moral claim that therefore it's wrong morally to torture innocent children. We can't go from those facts about what's going on to the value claim that it's therefore morally wrong to do it. Okay, that's what's stated in the fact-value distinction, or the is-ought problem. Okay, in other words, I can assert that all of those factual statements are true, and it would not follow that the conclusion is necessarily true as a result. All right, the conclusion can still be false, even if all those premises are true. And we'll contrast this to a simple categorical syllogism, which I've given you on the screen. If you have not studied logic, this is a very basic syllogism. I think you'll be able to follow it. This is a standard famous one. Everybody uses this when they teach logic, but all men are mortal. That's your first premise. Okay, and the way an argument works, if you're not familiar, is premises are set up and they lead you through rational deduction to a conclusion. And the idea is if the premises are true, the conclusion should necessarily follow and would also have to be true if it's a valid argument. So premise one is all men are mortal. Premise two is that Socrates is man. And at this point, if you're just rational and reasoning in a very ordinary way, you should be able to figure out the next step in the conclusion that Socrates is mortal. Okay, because if 1 and 2 are true, not saying that they are, but if they are true, then 3 has to be true as well. All right. So that's different than what we looked at a second ago. The argument we were looking at a second ago about torturing children, even if those premises are true, it still doesn't guarantee our conclusion. So it's a very different type of an argument. Okay. So that's the problem with the fact-value distinction. So just grasp the general idea. You cannot move from facts about the world to value claims. You cannot start with what is the case and then conclude about what ought to be the case. Okay, so this is problem number 1. I'm going to get to a little bit more on that in a second. Let me go on to something that's related to it, very closely related to it. It's what's called the naturalistic fallacy. Now, the naturalistic fallacy is subtly different, but you're going to see some overlap. And I'm not going to, talk about exactly where these two things differ, but I do want you to try to grasp what we're saying with the naturalistic fallacy. Now, here's the basic argument. I'm going to run through it as we look through the slide here. What we're going to try to demonstrate is when we try to define the term good using only natural facts about the world, it's going to simply fail. Okay, you cannot define good using natural facts about the world. Now, here's some examples of systems that have tried to define the word good according to certain natural facts or criteria. So hedonism, for instance, which we're going to study later this semester, defines the good as what is pleasurable. In other words, good means pleasurable. Okay, those two terms would be interchangeable on this line. Utilitarianism, which we're going to study after we do hedonism later, is going to define good as, something that guarantees the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Rousseau would define good as whatever the majority says is good, kind of a conventional cultural type of a definition. Plato might define good, not might, but does define good as whatever best imitates the forms. Darwinian thought might decide that good is whatever promotes survival of the species or things like that. So we're all trying to define good in a different way. Now, follow along. All naturalistic definitions of the good can be formulated in this way. X is good means that X has property P, a certain property. Okay, so X is good means that X has this property. Now, we could use two questions now to analyze this naturalistic kind of definition. The first question is, X has P, but does X have P? Now, that may sound like a weird question, and it should. Let me get back to that in a second. The second question is, X has property P, but is X good? Now, already that question may sound not as bizarre as the first question. There's a reason for that. Okay, because when we ask question number one, it actually ends up sounding kind of nonsensical, right? You can't assert that X has a property and then ask whether or not it has that property. Well, we just said it has that property. Okay, so it seems foolish to say, does it really? Okay. So again, I'll just use the example now of putting in the property. Torture gives the sadist pleasure. But does torture give the sadist pleasure? Well, you just said it did, so that seems like a bizarre question to ask. All right, so far, hopefully you're with me. The second question would make sense, though. All right, torture gives the sadist pleasure, but is torture good? All right, it seems like we're asking a different question at the end after we make that claim. Okay, step 3 here is if good were really defined by some kind of natural property P, then the two questions should actually be the same exact question, right? Because all you'd be doing is replacing have property P with the word good, okay? And those two things should be equivalent. They should be the same. Now, of course, question 2, when you read it, is not identical to question 1. One is nonsensical and one makes perfect sense. If there is some kind of substantial difference between the two questions, then they can't be the same question. Therefore, good is not really defined in terms of a natural property. Okay, that's the idea of the naturalistic fallacy. And again, think of it as replacing has property, whatever, P, with the word good. Okay? And if you end up with a different question, then of course the concept's a different concept. Because if good meant has property P, then those two questions would be exactly the same. All right. Now that's an argument about defining the word good. It's an argument about definition. It's not arguing that you cannot use the word good to describe natural things, right? So I could still say pleasure is good, or happiness is good, or survival is good. Okay. What I'm not saying is pleasure is the same as good, and that those two words mean the same thing and can be interchangeable. They can't. Okay. The argument does attempt, again, to define good with those properties. It's always possible to ask, is X good? Like when we ask the question of pleasure, right? Is this pleasure good? Well, possibly yes, possibly no. Sometimes certain pleasures we would say are good. And you could probably think of things that are pleasurable that you may say are bad. Maybe drugs. You could imagine heroin would probably be fairly pleasurable. But is it a good thing? Most people would probably say, no, it's not a good thing. Therefore, pleasure and good are not the same thing. Because how could you have a pleasure that is bad if pleasure is, by definition, good? Okay, so hopefully you get the idea with naturalistic fallacy. Now, the consequence of this fact-value distinction and naturalistic fallacy for moral reasoning is that when we reason through a situation, to come to some kind of value judgment as a conclusion, you're going to have to start with a value judgment as an initial premise, right? Moral value judgments are derived from moral principles. And if you remember the initial PowerPoint for the semester where we just introduced moral philosophy and moral reasoning, we talked a little bit about that. A moral value judgment that is general in nature is what we would use as a principle. And it's from that principle that they then derive through this reasoning process the conclusion that is a moral value judgment that is going to be particular in nature. Right? And I'll use the same example that I did in that PowerPoint in a second. Right? Now, we do this through a deduction. We start with our general principle that we call the moral value judgment. Then we have a second premise that is going to be a factual premise. And through logical deduction, you're going to derive your conclusion, which is, again, going to be a value judgment. And again, the fact-value distinction says I can't just start with facts and end up with values. If I'm going to end up with a value statement, at least one of those two premises must have some kind of value judgment already built in. Hopefully that makes sense to you. All right. And we're also employing what's called the consistency principle, which was in that PowerPoint before, which basically says that if you're going to if there's no relevant difference between two things, then you should treat those two things the same way. So let's look at this example again, where I start with a general moral principle, which is it's wrong to harm people. All right, we're going to say that's our moral value judgment. That's general in nature. People, it's a pretty general term, meaning all people. Okay. The minor premise is Terence is a person. All right. So if I have the idea that it's wrong to harm people, and I have Terence is people, my conclusion is it would be wrong to harm Terence. Okay, and that would be my moral value judgment. But I can't just go, right, from the claim, the factual claim that Terence is a person, therefore it's wrong to harm him. I can't move from one to the other. I need to start with that other premise that said it's wrong to harm people in general before I can get there. Hopefully that makes sense. Of course, there's still a little bit of a problem. Right? This is a valid argument. The problem is going to be at the bottom of this slide here. Actually, let me just give some of the other examples since it's on the screen, and I don't want to skip over anything that I might regret later. But naturalistic fallacy, look at these examples, right? Number one. Your stereo is so loud that the downstairs neighbors are getting stomach aches, you ought to turn it down. All right, that first statement, your stereo is so loud that downstairs neighbors are getting stomach aches, that's just stating a fact. And then the conclusion is you ought to do something about it. You ought to turn it down. This is a value claim, a value judgment, right? Now, that's not a valid argument. That's the problem. What you need to make it a value argument is you're going to have to stick in another premise, like you shouldn't enjoy music at a volume that gives other people stomach aches. So here you're putting out a statement that tells you what you ought or ought not do. Now you can make the valid argument that you should turn the music down. Okay. So anyways, the question at the bottom of this slide is how do you get the initial moral value judgment that's going to act as your moral premise? Right? How do you get that initial moral value general principle to begin with? If we can't get it from facts, is this just completely arbitrary? Right? Maybe if I start with the principle, I can reason through to a particular conclusion. But where did that principle come from? Okay? If I want to say, well, it comes from some kind of facts about the world, then I'm back to the problem. Well, I can't derive that from facts about the world. There's got to be some way I can obtain that initial general principle. So the fact-value distinction is going to raise the problem that, I'm not going to know where exactly am I going to pull these moral principles from as a foundation for my moral reasoning. Okay, so that's the first problem. Let's do a thought experiment. Before we get to this next problem, these little thought experiments are going to introduce kind of the topic we're about to discuss. And I want you to think through the example that I'm going to give you. And as I introduce it, I would recommend that you pause the video and think about your answers to these questions before you continue on with the thing. When I do this in a classroom setting, it's usually a lot of fun, and we get off the PowerPoint for a while, and we have some really interesting discussion. But with the video format, it's not always going to be as easy to do that. So thought experiments is this. Let's talk about the responsible rapist. It's not a pretty picture, but let's assume that a man forces himself upon a woman sexually, ignoring her pleas to stop. Right? She is definitely resisting and begging for him to stop. The guy's arrested, as he should be. Is it right? Of course, I shouldn't be saying as he should be. I'm kind of imposing value judgment in there already. But anyways, the question is it right to hold him responsible and punishable for his actions? Now go ahead and stop for a second the video and think about that. Right? You probably have the initial idea that, yes, he is responsible for what he did, and he probably should be punished. That's kind of our normal reaction to those types of things. So let me change the scenario slightly, and hopefully you'll get where I'm going in a second. Next thought experiment. We're going to take, again, the same scenario of rape. If you're familiar with comic books, you might be familiar with this particular character. I'm a big comic book fan, so as a DC character by the name of Deadman. If you've never heard of him, he's a ghost. And his particular ability is he could take possession of various people. So he could just kind of jump into my body and drive me like a car. I would be shut off, basically consciously. I don't know what's going on until he jumps out of my body, in which I would wake up and continue with my life, maybe not even knowing that he's been there. Okay, so that's kind of the scenario. So a man in this picture is possessed by Deadman, jumps in, takes him over. So Deadman forces himself sexually upon a woman using this other man's body. Now the question is it right to hold the man responsible and punishable for the action? So stop and think about that for a second. Now many of you have probably already said, well, there's a little bit of a different intuition there. The first guy seems like, yeah, he is responsible. But the second guy doesn't seem to be responsible because he is not conscious of what's going on. Somebody else is driving him, right? Like the car that I mentioned. So maybe he's not responsible, but the first guy is. All right. Now, the third little modification is, let's change it just slightly. Instead of doing a DC character, let's go over to Marvel, and we'll use the famous android, the Vision. Okay, now, of course, he's a sentient android. Let's just treat him as purely robotic for the sake of this example, right? So the Vision is going to force himself sexually upon a woman. Now, is it right to hold him responsible and punishable? And you got to think now, no matter how complex he is and how close to being an actual human being he may seem, he's still just a machine working off code and programming. Is he responsible for what he's done? Or is the programmer perhaps responsible for what he's done? Okay, so now you've thought through this a little bit. The issue that we're actually dealing with is the issue of what we call determinism. This is problem number 2 for this class. Famous slogan that I want you to be comfortable with is this phrase, ought implies can. The idea is if I ought to do something, or if I have an obligation to do something, then I must have the ability to do it or not do it. It's within my power in a certain sense. Right? Because obligation entails an ability to act. For morality or law to have any claim on the individual, it must be possible for the individual to perform those acts and maintain those attitudes required by the moral or legal obligation. Okay? Would it make sense to say that somebody ought to do acts if they couldn't possibly do it? And I use the example here of, the idea that if you love your son, then you're going to fly up into the tree and retrieve the kite that got stuck up in the branches. Now, I can't really say that you ought to fly up into the tree to get the kite if it's impossible for the person to fly. That just doesn't make any sense. You cannot command or hold somebody responsible to do the impossible. Okay? Responsibility entails an ability to act or act otherwise, and you can't be held accountable for behavior that's outside of your control. Like if I was walking along and I bumped into you and you bumped into somebody else, you're not responsible for bumping into that other person because that's not something that was in your control. Okay? So that's the idea of this ought implies can. Now, determinism is this idea that things are not in our control in a certain sense. And it's been a historical question. Lots of different worldviews historically have held to the idea that there are certain things that are determined. If you go back, for instance, the Homeric worldview, the ancient Greeks, you have this concept of fate or moira, and that everything is ruled over by the gods, or ultimately the fates themselves, who even have authority over the gods. Ancient astrology basically sees that everything that happens upon the earth is governed in a certain sense by the heavenly bodies up above, right? You have a certain fixed destiny if you're born under a certain sign, and even modern astrology has a little bit of this as well, right? Medieval theology brings up this idea of determinism when it starts to think of the nature of God. If you think of, the famous question, if God knows everything, then could you have possibly done anything different than you actually did? And this has a lot of weight, and it's kind of an interesting thing to think about if this were a theology or even a metaphysics class. But the idea here is God knows everything infallibly. And it's necessary that if God knows that X is going to happen in the future, that X will happen in the future, because he can't be wrong about that. And of course, God does know X will happen. Therefore, it seems that X necessarily happens, that it must happen, and there's no choice in the matter. So if X knows if God knows that tomorrow I'm going to have Cheerios for breakfast, of course, he's right about that. So tomorrow it's already determined that I'm going to have Cheerios for breakfast, and there's nothing I can do to change that. I can't change my mind and decide to have something else, because then God's knowledge would have been wrong. God's knowledge is never wrong. Therefore, I don't really have the freedom that I think that I have. You can even get into the more modern era. We get into the Enlightenment, the dawn of the scientific age. You look at the idea that everything is governed by the laws of nature. Pierre-Simon Laplace basically viewed nature as governed by laws that are absolutely deterministic. And he claimed that if he knew all natural laws and had a complete description of the universe at a given moment, he could predict infallibly every event that would happen in the future, as well as recount every event that has taken place prior, because everything's just a chain of cause and effect. Right? If I know what the effect is now, I could figure out the causes that got me there, and I know what the effects are now are going to be causes for future effects later on down the road. It's a very strict form of determinism, that everything just kind of works out that way. The only reason we're ever in doubt or question whether it's probable that such and such is going to happen is because we don't know all of the factors involved. If you had complete knowledge of those things, then you would know exactly what's going to happen. So when you go pick up, the lottery, as the balls are bouncing around the lottery machine and the numbers come out, we think this is kind of random. What are the chances of you winning? They're astronomically, outrageous. But if you knew exactly where all the balls sat when the machine is turned on, if you knew exactly how much air and what force and direction the air went into the machine, you could predict, just based on pure physics, exactly which balls would come up and you'd win the lottery. Okay, it's just that we don't have that information. It's too much for us to calculate. Now, the more modern view of contemporary philosophers of science have a less rigid idea of natural law, that it's not completely deterministic, but more probabilistic rather than absolute. So it's not if X happened, then Y necessarily follows, but if X happens, then necessarily you're going to have A, B, or C that is going to follow. So it's still a cause-effect relationship, but it's a weaker form of causality. And I think it still threatens the idea of obligation or responsibility. The idea with the determinism is the view that every event is caused and every event follows inevitably from the events that precede it. Right? So that's the definition of determinism that I want you to know. Now, what I mean by determinism, or why it's a problem really for moral philosophy, is because when we talk about oughts, obligations, and things like that, if things are determined, then that wouldn't make any sense any longer, right? If everything I do necessarily, if everything I do, I did not have a choice to do, then I can't be held responsible. You can't tell me I ought to do this or I ought to do that. So in the statement, it's wrong to murder, right? Or you ought not to murder. There's no point in telling somebody you ought not to murder, because if they murder, then it's simply because of certain conditions that forced him or her to do that thing. If that makes sense to you. Okay, so hopefully you see the weight of these two problems. The fact-value distinction, problem number one, and determinism, problem number two. As we go through these PowerPoints, we get to really the third and fourth PowerPoint, the fourth and fifth PowerPoint, we're going to be looking at a way to respond to these problems, or different attempts to respond to these problems from within certain philosophical contexts. So we'll go back and revisit the fact value problem and see how some people have responded. We'll go back and visit determinism and see what the alternative explanation might be. If things aren't determined, what are they? So we're going to come back to that later. As for now, that's it for this particular little presentation. I will see you again when I do the next presentation. So thank you for watching, and make sure you study through these PowerPoints a little bit more slowly. Read through them and do try to understand exactly what I'm saying. Take your time. It can be frustrating, but I know that you can get it. So take care.